Most people believe that the final 24 hours of Jesus' life were simply a necessary tragedy, a painful yet predictable march toward the cross, ordained by destiny itself. In church, we are taught the simplified timeline of betrayal, suffering, and resurrection, viewing these events as a singular, inescapable sacrifice. But the Bible says in the book of Luke, chapter 22, verse 39, that Jesus went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him, indicating that even in these final moments, human choice and agonizing spiritual conflict still dictated every step, challenging the notion of passive acceptance. However, if the ultimate victory of salvation was guaranteed by the resurrection 3 days later, why did God allow his own Son to experience such profound, overwhelming mental and physical anguish in the Garden of Gethsemane that he sweat drops of blood, a biological and psychological phenomenon that few human beings ever face? What are they hiding from us about the intensity of that final day, about the precise, calculated movements of the forces arrayed against him, and the profound theological stakes that transcended mere crucifixion? Today, you will discover the truth behind the veil of religious tradition, tracing the footsteps of the Messiah from the upper room to the tomb, understanding not just what happened, but why those 24 hours truly redefined human history. Get ready to experience the most detailed, hour-by-hour account of the greatest drama ever recorded. The air in Jerusalem was thick with anticipation. It was Thursday evening, or according to the Jewish calendar, the start of Nisan 15, the high holy day of Passover. Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims had flooded the city, turning the narrow, stone-paved streets into a bustling river of humanity. The atmosphere was charged not only with religious fervor, but with deep, simmering political tension. The Roman legions were everywhere, their polished bronze helmets glinting under the sunset, acutely aware that any large gathering of Jews could swiftly turn into an insurrection, especially one celebrating liberation from slavery. Jesus and his 12 disciples had secured a simple upper room, likely through a secret contact, a crucial move, because they knew the authorities, the powerful Sanhedrin, were actively seeking his life, not just for his revolutionary teachings, but for daring to challenge their spiritual and political authority directly. Picture the scene. It is a humble room, sparsely decorated, perhaps lit by flickering oil lamps casting long, dancing shadows on the plastered walls. This was not a grand banquet, but a deeply intimate, profoundly symbolic meal. The disciples sat reclining around the table, the traditional posture for the Passover Seder, a posture meant to symbolize the freedom they were celebrating. Yet the mood was far from joyful. It was heavy, filled with a sense of foreboding that permeated every corner of the room. Jesus knew this was the farewell, the ultimate curtain call before the storm, and his words to them were loaded with meaning that they could only partially grasp at that moment. He began the ritual meal, transforming the ancient ceremony of liberation into the new covenant of grace. He took the bread, broke it, and gave it to them, saying, "Take, eat, this is my body which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." His voice, usually firm and compelling, perhaps held a slight tremor of sorrow, an acknowledgement of the physical suffering he was about to endure. He then took the cup of wine, the third cup, often called the cup of redemption, and declared, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for many for the remission of sins." This was more than religious ritual. This was the establishment of a foundational truth, a theological pivot point. But the solemnity was abruptly shattered by a chilling revelation. Jesus looked across the table at the faces he loved, faces that had followed him for 3 years, and spoke the words that pierced the silence like a dagger. "Truly, truly I say to you, one of you who eats with me will betray me." The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Imagine the confusion, the shock, the quick, suspicious glances darting between the disciples. They began to question among themselves, a chorus of anxious murmurs rising. "Lord, is it I? Surely not I." Peter, always impulsive, perhaps leaned across the table and urgently signaled to John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, who was reclining closest to Jesus, asking him to inquire who the betrayer was. John, resting his head near the Lord's chest, whispered the question. Jesus responded with a specific, yet still somewhat veiled sign. "It is he to whom I shall give a piece of bread when I have dipped it." He dipped the bread, a gesture of friendship and honor, and handed it directly to Judas Iscariot. The irony of receiving an honorific gesture immediately preceding the ultimate act of treachery is profound. John records that after Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. This description is chilling, suggesting a final, complete surrender of Judas's will to the forces of darkness. Jesus looked at Judas, perhaps with profound sadness, perhaps with quiet acceptance of the divine necessity, and said, "What you do, do quickly." None of the other disciples truly understood this exchange, believing Judas was being sent out to buy necessary provisions or give money to the poor, because he held the group's money bag. Judas rose, leaving the intimate warmth of the upper room, plunging immediately into the cool, treacherous darkness of the Jerusalem night. It was the moment the final 24 hours truly began, the clock ticking towards midnight, and the Garden of Gethsemane. With Judas gone, a palpable shift occurred. The intimacy deepened, the sorrow mixed with instruction. Jesus spent the next hour or two delivering what is now known as the farewell discourse, recorded primarily in John chapters 13 through 17. He spoke of the coming Comforter, the Holy Spirit who would guide them, of the necessity of love, and of the profound connection between the vine and the branches. He prepared them for persecution, for the inevitable scattering that was about to take place. He offered them comfort, but did not shield them from the reality of the coming suffering. Peter, always full of bravado and conviction, declared, "Lord, I am ready to go with you, both to prison and to death." Jesus looked at him, knowing the future perfectly, and responded with that devastating prophecy, "I tell you, Peter, the rooster shall not crow this day before you will deny me 3 times." Peter's confidence, built on human strength, was about to crumble under the pressure of fear. Around the hour of midnight, or perhaps shortly before, they concluded the meal. After singing a hymn, likely the traditional Hallel psalms, they left the safety of the upper room and moved quietly through the dark, sleeping streets of Jerusalem. Their destination was the Mount of Olives, specifically a place known as Gethsemane, meaning oil press. This garden, situated just across the Kidron Valley, was a familiar retreat for Jesus and his disciples, a place of peace and contemplation. And it was this familiarity that Judas exploited. Imagine walking across the deep, dark valley floor, the air heavy with the scent of olive trees. When they arrived at Gethsemane, Jesus took only Peter, James, and John, the inner circle, the same 3 who had witnessed his transfiguration, further into the grove. He asked them, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful even to death. Stay here and watch with me." Then he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, a distance symbolizing the profound isolation he was entering. This was the moment of peak spiritual agony, the true Gethsemane crisis that often gets overshadowed by the physical suffering of the cross. Jesus fell on his face, a posture of absolute submission and overwhelming distress. He prayed to his Father, an intense, repeated plea. "O my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." We must pause here to understand the intensity of this moment. The cup he referred to was not merely the cup of physical torture or execution. Many martyrs throughout history have faced death bravely. This cup was the divine necessity of absorbing the entirety of human sin, past, present, and future, and enduring the terrifying experience of spiritual separation from the Father, the necessary consequence of sin being placed upon him. This separation, this bearing of divine wrath, was the horror that caused him to sweat what the Gospel of Luke describes as great drops of blood falling to the ground. This rare medical condition, known as hematidrosis, is caused by extreme psychological stress or terror rupturing capillaries near the sweat glands. His body was already failing under the sheer weight of spiritual and emotional burden, hours before the first soldier laid a hand on him. He returned to the 3 disciples and found them sleeping. He roused Peter, gently rebuking him. "Could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." He went away a second time and prayed the same words, the agony intensifying. He returned again, found them sleeping again, their eyes heavy with fatigue. He prayed a third time, submitting fully to the Father's will. The battle was fought and won in the garden. The decision was sealed. He would drink the cup. It was probably now somewhere between 1 and 3 o'clock in the morning, officially the Friday morning of Nisan 15. The silence of the garden was suddenly broken by the sound of approaching noise, the clanging of metal, the murmur of many voices, the flickering light of torches moving through the olive trees. The betrayal was upon them. Judas, leading a large company, arrived. This company was a terrifying mixture. Roman soldiers, likely a cohort or part of one, identifiable by their organized discipline, and the temple guards, the Jewish police force, identifiable by their local attire. Judas knew the routine, and he had provided the specific identifying sign. "The one I kiss," he had told them. "He is the one. Seize him and lead him away safely." Judas approached Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him, the ultimate symbol of affection twisted into the seal of treachery. Jesus responded with crushing sadness and insight. "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" This single sentence encapsulates the tragedy of misplaced allegiance and the profundity of Jesus' knowledge. As the soldiers and guards moved to seize him, Peter, true to his earlier declaration, drew a sword, perhaps one of the 2 swords they had brought, and wildly swinging, struck the servant of the high priest, Malchus, cutting off his right ear. This moment of desperate human intervention was instantly corrected by divine authority. Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Or do you think that I cannot now pray to my Father, and he will instantly provide me with more than 12 legions of angels?" Then, showing compassion even in the face of his own imminent arrest, Jesus touched Malchus's ear and instantly healed him, providing the arresting party with irrefutable proof of his power, a miracle performed even as he submitted to their powerlessness. Jesus then turned to the assembled crowd of temple guards and soldiers, speaking with quiet dignity. "Have you come out, as against a robber, with swords and clubs, to take me? I sat daily with you in the temple, teaching, and you did not seize me. But all this was done that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled." The disciples, seeing the overwhelming force, instantly scattered. The prophecies of the shepherd being struck and the sheep scattering were fulfilled in that terrified instant. Jesus was utterly alone, save for his captors. The arresting party bound Jesus and marched him back across the Kidron Valley, up the steep streets toward the house of Annas, the former high priest and the true power broker behind the current high priest, Caiaphas, his son-in-law. Annas was the kingmaker, still holding enormous sway. This stop at Annas's residence was purely for intimidation and preliminary questioning, an attempt to extract an early confession or recantation before the official Sanhedrin trial. It was the first stop on the judicial path to the cross. As Jesus was being led away, one disciple, John, perhaps with another unnamed disciple, managed to follow at a distance. Peter, however, followed more hesitantly, drawn by a mixture of curiosity, love, and terrible fear. He managed to slip into the courtyard of the high priest's palace. This courtyard was a hive of activity, even in the dead of the night. Torches flared, casting eerie shadows, and a charcoal fire had been lit in the center, for the Jerusalem nights could be chilly, especially after midnight. Peter sat down with the servants and the guards, trying to blend in, trying to appear merely as one of the curious onlookers. Inside the palace, Annas interrogated Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. Jesus refused to engage in a secret, illegal investigation. He said, "I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where the Jews always meet, and in secret I have said nothing. Why do you ask me? Ask those who heard me what I said to them." This defiant, truth-telling answer infuriated one of the officers standing by, who struck Jesus across the face, saying, "Do you answer the high priest like that?" Jesus, facing the first physical assault of the night, responded with calm righteousness. "If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why do you strike me?" Annas, having achieved nothing, sent Jesus bound over to Caiaphas, the high priest. The high-stakes drama of the official Sanhedrin trial commenced. This assembly of 71 powerful Jewish leaders, scribes, Pharisees, and elders, was convened in the early hours of the morning, hours before dawn, a clear violation of Jewish legal procedure, which prohibited capital trials at night. They were desperate. The Passover festival was about to begin, and they needed Jesus dealt with swiftly before the Jewish populace, many of whom supported him, could interfere. They sought witnesses, but the witnesses they brought forward could not agree. They twisted Jesus' words about destroying the temple and rebuilding it in 3 days, but their testimony was contradictory. Matthew chapter 26 records that many false witnesses came forward, but their testimony did not hold water. The entire process was a farce, a politically motivated kangaroo court disguised as a religious tribunal. Caiaphas, witnessing the failure of the false witnesses, stood up in the midst of the assembly, desperation etched on his face. He demanded the ultimate answer. "I adjure you by the living God that you tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." This was the pivotal question, demanding an answer that carried the death penalty for blasphemy under Jewish law. Jesus, who had remained silent through the contradictory testimonies, responded with clear, devastating authority. "It is, as you said. Nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven." The moment those words left his lips, the dramatic and inevitable reaction occurred. Caiaphas, in a performance of ritual piety and outrage, tore his own clothes, a symbolic gesture of profound horror at the perceived blasphemy. "He has spoken blasphemy. What further need do we have of witnesses? Look, now you have heard his blasphemy. What do you think?" The answer from the assembled council was unanimous. "He is deserving of death." This judicial verdict, though legally flawed, sealed Jesus' fate in the minds of the Jewish authorities. It was still dark, perhaps just before 4 o'clock in the morning. Having condemned him, the guards and servants began to mock and abuse him physically. They blindfolded him, struck him, and taunted him, saying, "Prophesy to us, Christ. Who is the one who struck you?" They spat on him. This was the start of the physical passion, the calculated dehumanization intended to break his spirit. Meanwhile, outside in the courtyard, Peter's fragile nerve finally snapped. As the light of the charcoal fire illuminated the faces around him, a servant girl approached him. "You also were with Jesus of Galilee," she stated confidently. Peter, engulfed by paralyzing fear, denied it instantly. "I do not know what you are saying." He moved away toward the gate, perhaps hoping to escape. A second girl saw him and said to those standing by, "This fellow also was with Jesus of Nazareth." Again, Peter denied it, this time reinforcing the denial with an oath. Finally, about an hour later, a group of bystanders gathered, noting Peter's Galilean accent, which was distinct from the Jerusalem dialect. One relative of Malchus, the servant whose ear Peter had sliced off, looked intently at him and asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Pushed to the absolute limit of panic and shame, Peter began to curse and swear, vehemently protesting, "I do not know the man." Immediately the rooster crowed. Luke's gospel records the heart-wrenching detail. The Lord turned and looked directly at Peter. Imagine that look, not of condemnation, but of deep penetrating sorrow and love. A look that recalled the prophecy made just hours before in the upper room. The weight of his failure crashed down upon Peter. He remembered the words of Jesus. Overwhelmed by agonizing remorse, he rushed out of the courtyard and wept bitterly. Peter's denial serves as a stark reminder that even the most fervent faith can momentarily collapse under the crushing weight of fear, but it also sets the stage for his eventual profound restoration. As the sun began to rise, marking the beginning of the legal day, the Sanhedrin finalized their morning session. Because they lacked the authority under Roman occupation to carry out an execution for capital crimes, they had to take Jesus to the Roman procurator, Pontius Pilate, the governing authority. The charge had to be changed from religious blasphemy, which Rome did not care about, to political sedition, which Rome took very seriously. The procession moved across the city to the Praetorium, the Roman headquarters, likely the Fortress Antonia adjacent to the temple, or perhaps Herod's palace. The Jewish leaders, in an absurd display of ritual purity, refused to enter the Roman building for fear of being defiled before the Passover festival. They presented Jesus to Pilate outside. This immediately set a tone of confrontation and hypocrisy. Pilate, a cynical and pragmatic Roman governor, came out and demanded, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" The Jewish leaders were evasive. "If he were not a criminal, we would not have delivered him up to you." They wanted Pilate merely to rubber-stamp their death sentence. Pilate, sensing their maneuvering and wishing to avoid a complex political situation, said, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." They were forced to admit the truth. It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death. This small interchange confirms the necessity of Roman involvement for the precise fulfillment of prophecy, specifically death by crucifixion, a Roman, not Jewish, method of execution. Pilate, now required to investigate the political charge, asked Jesus directly, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "It is as you say," but then clarified the nature of his kingdom. "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate, confused by this spiritual claim, pressed further, "You are a king, then?" Jesus' definitive reply was, "You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Pilate, the hardened bureaucrat, dismissed this lofty rhetoric with one of history's most famous and cynical questions. What is truth? Pilate saw clearly that Jesus posed no political threat to Rome. He was merely the target of religious envy. Pilate went back out to the Jews and declared, "I find no fault in him." At this crucial juncture, the fate of Judas Iscariot unfolded. Seeing that Jesus was truly condemned and about to be delivered to the Romans for execution, Judas was overwhelmed by remorse. He realized the terrifying extent of his actions. He returned to the chief priests and elders, attempting to return the 30 pieces of silver, the price of his betrayal, declaring, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." The religious leaders, masters of hypocrisy, dismissed him coldly. "What is that to us? You see to that." They had used him and now discarded him. Judas threw the money into the temple treasury and, tormented by guilt and despair, went and hanged himself. The chief priests, realizing they could not put the blood money back into the treasury, used it to purchase the potter's field, a burial place for strangers, fulfilling yet another ancient prophecy. Pilate, trying to dodge responsibility, seized upon a detail mentioned by the chief priests. They said Jesus stirred up the people, beginning from Galilee. Learning Jesus was a Galilean, Pilate quickly decided to send him to Herod Antipas, the tetrarch of Galilee, who was conveniently in Jerusalem for the Passover festival. This was a political maneuver, an attempt to pass the buck, but it only prolonged Jesus' agony and subjected him to further humiliation. Jesus was marched to Herod's palace. Herod was actually delighted. He had long wanted to see Jesus, hoping to witness some miraculous spectacle. He plied Jesus with many questions, perhaps asking him to turn water into wine or heal someone instantly. But Jesus remained completely silent. The chief priests and scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. Jesus' absolute refusal to speak frustrated Herod greatly. Herod and his soldiers, perceiving Jesus as a harmless fool, mocked him. They dressed him in a gorgeous robe, a parody of royal attire, and sent him back to Pilate, signifying that Herod found him ridiculous but not treasonous. This act, paradoxically, sealed a momentary friendship between the politically estranged Pilate and Herod. Jesus returned to the praetorium, now dressed in a theatrical, mocking royal garment. Pilate made one final effort to release him. It was the custom during Passover to release one prisoner chosen by the crowd. Pilate presented the people with a choice between Jesus, whom he called the King of the Jews, and Barabbas, a notorious criminal, a thief, insurrectionist, and murderer. Pilate genuinely expected the crowd to choose Jesus, but the chief priests and elders had been diligently working the crowd. They stirred up the masses, urging them to ask for Barabbas and demand Jesus' execution. Pilate asked the crucial question, "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" The crowd roared back, "Barabbas." Pilate, astonished and exasperated, asked, "What then shall I do with Jesus who is called Christ?" The unified, frightening reply came back, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate tried to reason, "Why, what evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him!" Pilate's private fear was intensified by a message from his wife, Claudia Procula, who had suffered greatly in a dream about Jesus, and warned her husband, "Have nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered many things today in a dream because of him." Caught between his conscience, the warning of his wife, and the threat of a Roman riot that could cost him his position, Pilate chose self-preservation. He had Jesus severely scourged first, hoping this brutal punishment, designed to flay the skin and tear the muscle, might satisfy the bloodlust of the crowd and the priests, allowing him to release a severely injured man. The Roman scourging was horrific, administered by expert flagellators using a whip called the flagellum, tipped with bone and lead weights. This was often lethal itself. After the scourging, the soldiers led Jesus into the common hall. There they continued their mockery, weaving a crown of long, sharp thorns and jamming it onto his head. They draped a purple robe over his lacerated back, placed a reed in his hand as a mock scepter, and began to kneel before him in vicious parody, spitting on him and striking his head with the reed, driving the thorns deeper. Pilate brought Jesus out one last time, bloody, beaten, and wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. He presented him to the public with the phrase, "Behold the man, exi homo." It was a plea for pity, But the chief priests and officers screamed louder, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" When Pilate suggested they handle the execution themselves, the Jews dropped the pretense of political charges and reverted to the core religious issue. We have a law, and according to our law, he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God. This revelation terrified Pilate. He went back inside, asking Jesus, "Where are you from?" Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate asserted his authority. "Do you not speak to me? Do you not know that I have power to crucify you and power to release you?" Jesus delivered the final, humbling truth to the Roman ruler. "You could have no power at all against me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin." Pilate desperately sought to release him, but the Jews played their ultimate card. "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar." This was a direct threat to Pilate's career and life. Defeated, Pilate took water and washed his hands before the multitude, dramatically declaring, "I am innocent of the blood of this just person." You see to it, the people accepted the responsibility with a terrifying pronouncement, "His blood be on us and on our children." The sentence was pronounced. Jesus of Nazareth was to be crucified. It was around 6 o'clock in the morning. The final, excruciating journey began. The soldiers stripped the purple robe off him and put his own garments back on him. A massive wooden crossbeam, called the patibulum, was laid across his raw, bleeding shoulders. The cross was deliberately designed to be the most agonizing and shameful form of execution, reserved for the lowest criminals and slaves. The weight of the beam alone, likely over 100 pounds, was overwhelming for a man who had not slept, had been betrayed, had endured internal agony in the garden, and had been mercilessly scourged. The journey led out of the city gates toward a small hill known as Golgotha, the place of the skull. The street they followed is traditionally known as the Via Dolorosa, the Way of Sorrow. The weight and the pain proved too much too soon. Jesus stumbled, perhaps fell repeatedly, and the Roman centurion in charge, wanting to expedite the execution and ensure the prisoner survived long enough for the cross, seized a man from Cyrene in North Africa named Simon, who was likely just arriving in Jerusalem for Passover, and compelled him to carry the crossbeam the rest of the way. A large crowd followed, some mocking, some grieving. Among the followers were many women of Jerusalem who wept openly for him. Jesus turned to them, and despite his own suffering, offered them a solemn warning. "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For indeed the days are coming in which they will say, 'Blessed are the barren, the wombs that never bore, and the breasts which never nursed.'" He was prophesying the horrific destruction of Jerusalem that would occur just 40 years later. They arrived at Golgotha, likely mid-morning, around 9 o'clock. As the process of crucifixion began, they offered him a drink of wine mixed with myrrh or gall, a common sedative intended to dull the pain. Mark's Gospel records that Jesus tasted it, but refused to drink. He chose to face the fullness of the agony with a clear mind, refusing the temporary relief. The soldiers stripped him entirely, fulfilling the prophecy that they would divide his garments among them and cast lots for his robe. They stretched him out onto the crossbeam and drove thick square iron nails through his wrists, which were technically the lower forearm bones, and then through his feet, nailing them to the upright post. The sound of the hammer striking the nails would have echoed across the hill, a horrifying punctuation mark to the violence. The cross was then lifted and violently dropped into the socket dug in the rock, jolting his entire body and amplifying the searing pain that traveled up his nerves. Above his head, Pilate had ordered a sign, an inscription written in 3 languages, Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, declaring the charge, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." The chief priests objected vehemently, demanding it be changed to read, "He said, I am the King of the Jews." Pilate, having had enough of their political games, gave the final, dismissive answer, "What I have written, I have written." Jesus was crucified between two criminals, two robbers or revolutionaries, fulfilling the prophecy that he would be numbered with the transgressors. The scene was one of utter humiliation, violence, and relentless mockery. The passers-by hurled abuse at him, wagging their heads and challenging him. "You who destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." The chief priests, scribes, and elders joined in the ridicule, the very people who should have recognized him as the fulfillment of Scripture. He saved others. Himself he cannot save. If he is the King of Israel, let him now come down from the cross, and we will believe him. Even one of the criminals crucified beside him railed at him, demanding, "If you are the Christ, save yourself and us." It was during these hours of supreme agony that Jesus spoke the first of his 7 final sayings. His very first words from the cross were a prayer of profound mercy for his executioners and mockers. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do." Then the second criminal, witnessing the silent endurance and the prayer of forgiveness, experienced a miraculous transformation of heart. He rebuked his fellow criminal and turned to Jesus, humbly asking, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus responded immediately, offering the second saying, one of immediate, unqualified assurance, "Assuredly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." The third saying was directed toward those closest to him, his mother Mary and John, the beloved disciple. Mary had followed him all the way to the foot of the cross, enduring the unimaginable sorrow of witnessing her son's torment. Seeing her and John standing together, Jesus tenderly spoke to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And then to John, "Behold your mother." In that moment, he entrusted the care of his earthly mother to his most loyal friend, ensuring her provision and comfort, even as his own life ebbed away. Around noon, the entire landscape plunged into profound supernatural darkness. For 3 hours, from the 6th hour to the 9th hour, noon until 3 in the afternoon, a darkness covered the land, a phenomenon that went beyond any natural eclipse, signifying the moment God was dealing with the reality of sin. It was during this terrifying darkness, around the 9th hour, that the most agonizing moment of the Passion occurred: separation. As the weight of all human sin, past, present, and future, was placed upon him, the spiritual connection between the Father and the Son, eternal and unbroken, was severed. This was the true cup Jesus dreaded in Gethsemane. In a loud, desperate cry of spiritual desolation, he uttered the 4th saying recorded in Aramaic, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," which translates to, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This cry was not merely physical pain, it was the unbearable anguish of spiritual abandonment, the necessary consequence of sin being borne by the sinless Son. Following this immense spiritual battle, Jesus experienced the crushing physical reality of dehydration and exhaustion. He uttered the 5th saying, a simple, raw declaration of physical suffering, "I thirst." A soldier, perhaps in a gesture of simple pity or perhaps to mock, quickly put a sponge soaked in sour wine or vinegar, a common soldier's drink, onto a hyssop branch and held it to his lips. Having received the drink, Jesus knew the work was complete. The prophecies were fulfilled, the law was honored, the required sacrifice was made. He cried out with a loud voice, the 6th saying, the declaration of victory and completion, "It is finished." Tetelestai, a Greek word often used in commercial contexts meaning the debt is paid in full. His final words, the 7th saying, were a prayer of total submission and trust, a peaceful relinquishing of his spirit back to the Father. "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." With that, Jesus bowed his head and died. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the very moment the evening Passover lambs were being ritually slaughtered in the temple, marking the final, ultimate sacrifice. The moment Jesus died, dramatic, terrifying events unfolded. The veil in the temple, the massive thick curtain separating the holy place from the Holy of Holies, the symbolic dwelling place of God, was violently torn in two, from top to bottom. This was not torn by human hands. It was a divine act, symbolizing that the path to God was now open to all, the barriers of ritual and separation shattered by the sacrifice. Furthermore, the earth shook violently, rocks were split apart, and tombs were opened, with many bodies of the saints who had died rising and appearing to many in Jerusalem after his resurrection. The centurion, the Roman commander in charge of the execution, witnessing the earthquake, the supernatural darkness, and the manner of Jesus' death, was struck with awe and declared, "Truly this man was the Son of God." Even the hardened Roman military men were forced to acknowledge the divine nature of the event. The Jewish authorities were now faced with a new problem. The Sabbath was fast approaching, and this particular Friday was the day of preparation for a high Sabbath, since the following day was both the weekly Sabbath and the Passover festival. Bodies could not remain hanging on the cross during such a holy time. They requested Pilate to break the legs of the crucified men, a practice called crucifixion, which hastened death by preventing the victims from pushing themselves up to breathe. The Roman soldiers came and broke the legs of the two criminals. When they came to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead. Thus, his legs were not broken, fulfilling the Old Testament prophecy regarding the Passover lamb. Not one of its bones shall be broken. However, to ensure absolute certainty of death, one of the soldiers thrust a spear into Jesus' side. Immediately, blood and water flowed out, providing modern medical testimony that his heart had burst, likely due to a condition called pericardial effusion, caused by the overwhelming physical and spiritual stress. This flow of blood and water also held profound symbolic meaning for the early church, representing the sacraments of baptism and communion. The final block of the 24 hours covers the burial. It was Friday late afternoon, approaching sunset, when the Sabbath would begin. Two brave, previously secretive followers came forward. The first was Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy, respected member of the Sanhedrin who had quietly dissented from the council's condemnation of Jesus. He boldly went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate, confirming the death with the centurion, granted the request. The second man was Nicodemus, the Pharisee who had secretly visited Jesus by night earlier in his ministry. He arrived bringing an immense amount of burial spices, a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds weight, a preparation usually reserved for kings or very wealthy individuals. Joseph took the body down from the cross. The body was wrapped in clean linen cloths, anointed with the spices, and laid in Joseph's own new tomb, which was hewn out of rock nearby. The speed of the burial was necessitated by the setting sun. The tomb was a dark, cool cave structure, and a great stone was rolled against the entrance. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary sat watching where the body was laid. The Jewish leaders, despite the onset of the Sabbath, went to Pilate the next day, Saturday, remembering Jesus' prophecy that he would rise in 3 days. They expressed their fear that his disciples would steal the body and claim resurrection. Pilate, tired of the whole affair, authorized them to take whatever security measures they deemed necessary. They sealed the massive stone door of the tomb with a Roman seal and placed a contingent of Roman guards to watch the site. The final 24 hours of Jesus' life had concluded with his body secured in a grave, seemingly the end of the radical movement, the utter failure of the promised Messiah. What profound lessons and theological certainties are embedded within these frantic, agonizing hours? First, The agony in Gethsemane confirms that the suffering of Christ was not merely physical, it was spiritual and voluntary. He faced the weight of universal sin and separation, demonstrating the depth of God's hatred for sin and the magnitude of the sacrifice required. This was not simply a man bravely facing death. This was the Creator experiencing the consequence of his creation's rebellion. The intense focus on fulfilling the ancient prophecies, from the price of the betrayal to the untouched bones and the piercing of the side, underlines the meticulous precision of God's eternal plan. Every single act, even the betrayal of Judas, was folded into a framework far grander than human comprehension, a testament to God's sovereignty over history and fate. Furthermore, the trials, illegal, rushed, and based on lies, expose the darkness of human nature when confronted with divine light. The hypocrisy of the Sanhedrin, refusing to enter the praetorium while plotting murder, and the cynical, self-serving cowardice of Pontius Pilate, washing his hands of a responsibility he clearly held, serve as timeless warnings against prioritizing comfort or political standing over truth and justice. Pilate knew the truth, yet he sentenced truth itself to death. The presence of the women at the cross, contrasted with the scattering of the men, highlights the steadfast loyalty and compassion often found in the marginalized. They bore witness to the ultimate sorrow, demonstrating that true faithfulness is not always demonstrated through strength, but often through enduring presence in the face of despair. Finally, the dramatic cosmological events, the darkness and the tearing of the temple veil, are seismic declarations that the old way of relating to God is over. The separation is gone. The ultimate high priest has offered the ultimate sacrifice, allowing direct, open access to the divine presence. The 24 hours did not end in defeat. They ended in the ultimate achievement, the payment of the debt, the completion of salvation's work. But this, my friends, is not where the story truly ends. We have traced the last 24 hours from the meal to the tomb, the moments of profound sorrow, terrifying betrayal, and ultimate sacrifice. We have seen the political maneuvering, the spiritual battle, and the human frailty displayed by the disciples. We have witnessed the perfect submission of the Son of Man. The sealed tomb and the armed guard signify the complete victory of the forces of death and darkness, according to human logic. But remember the prophecy of the temple being rebuilt in 3 days. Remember the promise to the thief on the cross. Remember the conviction of the centurion. If these hours were defined by despair and death, then the subsequent hours, the time leading up to the dawn of Sunday, would be defined by a deafening, terrifying silence, a silence that held the potential for the greatest reversal in history. What you have just heard is the most detailed account available, explaining what truly happened, moment by excruciating moment. We have covered the preparation for the crucifixion, the political failures, the physical agony, and the ultimate theological declarations. This entire sequence was designed not just to eliminate a troublesome teacher, but to fulfill a destiny laid out before the foundation of the world. Understanding the sheer weight of this darkness is essential to appreciating the brilliance of the light that follows. Do you truly grasp the depth of Jesus' loneliness, the agony of the betrayal, and the calculated cruelty of his judges? It is a story that demands reflection and reverence. Now, if this deep dive into the historical and spiritual truth has opened your eyes to the overwhelming reality of the sacrifice, I urge you, do not let this truth simply fade into the noise of the internet. We spent hours meticulously detailing every step of this journey for you. If you want more historical and biblical truth presented in this detailed narrative style, then you must act now. Ensure you click that like button right now to tell YouTube this content matters, and most importantly, subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss a revelation of this magnitude again. Share this video with 5 friends who need to understand the true cost of their faith. Leave a comment below telling me which part of the last 24 hours you found the most shocking. Was it the betrayal kiss, the sweating blood in Gethsemane, or Pilate's cowardice? Your engagement fuels this mission to uncover the truth. Click, subscribe, comment, and prepare yourself for the sequel, because the silence of the tomb is about to be shattered.